Talk today. This is the first time I've given a soft skills talk at Star Trek, but I was able to get some I think good content here that I think will kind of apply across all kinds of disciplines. So hopefully you'll find it both entertaining and useful. Just a little bit about me. That's my Twitter handle there, and I've got a copy of Fail Better, Design Smarter Mistakes, and Succeed Sooner down here that I'll give away to somebody randomly that tweets during the talk today. So if you want a chance to pick up a copy of this good book, then just tweet at me at Sirius_B. You'll see this is at the bottom of my slide deck here. In just 1 second, I'm going to hit my record button on this. Apologize. Okay. All right, we're back in business. All right. So yeah, if you'd like a chance to win this, please do that. I work at a company called Highland Software in Westlake, Ohio, up by Cleveland. Yes, we have a slide. That's a slide in the picture there for people to get down to the cafeteria. We're hiring, so if anybody's looking for a job, there's positions open in almost all the departments. We make a product called OnBase. It's a software platform that is used for enterprise content management, business process management. It's pretty ubiquitous. It's used in all kinds of companies around the world and throughout the United States. So you can check us out at onbase.com. So this talk, and which is it's about failure, but it's really about how to understand failure, how to use failure to your advantage. And really to kind of confront it in many ways. And in order to really get at this idea and this concept, I felt that I needed to really kind of start with some really big examples of failure that we may have all be a little bit familiar with to kind of set the stage. And the first one, and I did a lot of research into all these things, and what kept coming up was this theme of pairs. There were a lot of things that were epic failures, famous, very public things that happened that kind of came in twos, and for whatever reason, they kind of paired up. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and talk about each one, and then I want to put some takeaways together before I move on to the next section on survivorship bias. So the first one is the Maginot Line. Now, the Maginot Line was a series of battlements and walls and protection that was erected along the border between France and Germany after World War I. The French, having endured a bunch of attacks by Germany during the war, did not want that to happen again. And so they got this brilliant idea that they build a giant wall between them and the Germans. And this turned out to not work out so well for them. In World War II, Germany famously invaded France by going around the wall through Belgium, and France surrendered 6 weeks later. But they could have taken a page of history and saw that the Great Wall of China, another very expensive and a largely ineffective barrier, was erected at great cost that did not do the thing that it was supposed to do, which was to keep out the Mongols. Nevertheless, that happened. In more recent times, how many of you remember the Zune? Microsoft Zune, right? Okay. So this product, which was developed by Microsoft, was kind of sort of be the answer to the iPod. The iPod was wildly successful, as we all remember. And the interesting thing about this is that the Zune, although it was a colossal flop, it never put a dent in the iPod sales. It wasn't really because it lacked the features or functionality that something like the iPod had. In fact, in many ways, it was superior technically to the iPod. But what they failed to take into account was that there was no integration with a content purveyor vertically integrated like iTunes had for the iPod. And ultimately, that's really what a lot of analysts think led to its demise. I mean, that and maybe a host of other things. But clearly, it wasn't just the one thing that they were trying to get right, which was to make it technologically superior. By contrast, the Newton, how many remember that? So yeah, this is going way back. So this was the first PDA that was ever put out. It was also a huge flop, and Apple spent a ton of money and R&D into producing this device that was going to be able to recognize your handwriting so that you could eliminate having to carry paper around, store your documents electronically. It was a great idea, and the promise of what it could do piqued the interest of a lot of people, but ultimately it severely underperformed. Its handwriting recognition software was atrocious, and so the technology really wasn't there yet to support it, and it was in a lot of ways ahead of its time because there wasn't a lot of ways to integrate it with other technologies the way that they eventually got it right with the iPad. Just after Web 2.0 kind of exploded, the king of social media for a long time was MySpace, and this was it was ubiquitous. It was everywhere, and it was wildly successful. So many people had Facebook, or I'm sorry, had MySpace pages, and also celebrities and bands and other things. But they kind of stopped. They had gotten to the point where they were successful with what they had produced, and they kind of felt invincible, and they didn't really respond to the changing times. And when Facebook came in, which was built by students instead of by record labels, they didn't respond or act quickly to what was happening there, and they were zoomed past by Facebook and rendered largely obsolete nowadays. Again, contrasting that with the healthcare.gov, when the Obama administration passed the Affordable Care Act that was seen as a success for the administration, it was a primary objective of Barack Obama's, and one of the key pieces to this was providing people with the ability to sign up for health insurance, and that was unfortunately the one thing you couldn't do on healthcare.gov when it launched. There were a hodgepodge of agencies and consultants that all kind of came together to put this website live, and because there was very little feedback and little communication between the groups, things like authentication and talking between the systems didn't work, and it was really kind of a big eyesore for the administration. Pretty big fail. A couple of things that caught my eye as I was researching some of the R&D that was done in the space program was, of course, we all know the Hubble Space Telescope was launched to be able to take much clearer pictures of celestial bodies and deep space objects because it would be free of the constraints that our atmosphere imposes. But when they launched it, even though it had the most perfect mirror ever made at that point, the calibration was off because of a miscalculation in measurements on a conversion metric. And so all the pictures came back super blurry, so it was completely defeated the purpose. NASA was able to repair this, obviously. We've seen all the beautiful pictures that the telescope has taken, but not before they had to spend a lot more money getting it up there and getting it fixed and recalibrating it to work. Now, contrast that with the Mars Climate Orbiter. This was a satellite that was more than 200 million in development, and it was launched to take measurements around Mars. And because the scientists failed to adhere to the conversion between imperial and metric units, when the orbiter reached Mars, that miscalculation proved to be catastrophic, and it crashed into the atmosphere before it could take any measurements and provide any data back. Big $200 million colossal failure there. A little bit more tragic to our environment. Everybody remembers the Deepwater Horizon tragedy. It was unprecedented, the amount of oil that was spilled into the Gulf at the time. This was due to human error and lack of maintenance. So no, unit tests, so to speak, at the human level were in place. And operator error with the Exxon Valdez, which was a much smaller spill, but because of where it occurred, when it occurred, was really one of the most devastating catastrophes in terms of the environment. But both could have been prevented if they had actually taken the time to put fail-safes in, like unit tests do for code, for example. Two of the most successful passenger travel lines at the early part of the century were operated Zeppelins and ocean liners. And in the case of both Titanic and Hindenburg, these companies were very successful and ultimately met their demise at the hands of these colossal catastrophes that took place. And again, being there and being a part of a time where they just sort of looked at like forward progress, but not taking that success and understanding that they needed to then go back and refine what they were doing in terms of safety and the way that the technology was built. Even the creators of the dirigibles knew that hydrogen was a highly flammable gas. It was not something that they had addressed because they were too focused on trying to expand and too focused on their own success. Ultimately, it proved to be their demise. And, maybe slightly less tragic, but no less epic, both the cola giants had their reformulation blunders. Crystal Pepsi was, famously terrible. But New Coke really probably is the more famous of all of them. And I'm just going to go a little story on this because you might not know how this kind of came about, but it points out something important about the way that things can be kind of narrowly focused on, and then that can ultimately lead to a failure that is one of the aspects of the survivorship bias. And that is, back in the day, Pepsi went to market with a campaign called the Pepsi Challenge, in which they had people come out and try with the blind taste tests 2 different colas and ask which they prefer. And then revealed, after that they had picked, either Pepsi or Coke. And what this showed, statistically speaking, is that people did prefer Pepsi over Coke. It was an empirical fact. It was, as much as it was marketing, it was actually also very empirical. And so much so that the management at Coke got, they were losing some market share to Pepsi, and they thought, oh gosh, they're figuring it out. Let's see if there's any truth to this. And so they did their own secret taste tests within the organization, and they reached the same conclusions that the Pepsi Challenge had, and that people did prefer Coke over Pepsi. And this was enough for them to get really drastic with what they were doing. They completely reworked their formula. They tweaked it so that they could get that flavor that would win out in that blind taste sip test. And the result of that was New Coke. They thought that they had a winner on their hands because based on this very narrow focus, they were able to see that they could beat in a taste test. But famously, everybody that had been faithful to Coke for years and years, they looked at this as kind of a slap in the face that this was their preferred brand, their preferred cola, and now they had been taken away, and they were outraged. Coke suffered greatly and reversed quickly and came back out with classic Coke, and the rest is history. It turns out that they didn't really look at the whole picture, and that a sip test is something that people would maybe tend to prefer something a little bit sweeter, but if you have to drink an entire beverage, that could be a little bit overpowering for people. And so by not looking at that bigger picture, they missed out and had this colossal blunder. This brings me to my last example of a historical epic failure, and that is really kind of a culmination of a lot of work done by a man named Thomas Midgley Jr. He was born in 1889 to the son of an inventor, and this guy was very ambitious. He went to work for a company called Delco in Dayton, Ohio, and at the time they got acquired by GM. And the automotive industry was searching for a solution to a problem called engine knock, in which the internal combustion of the gasoline that was entering into the chambers, the pistons of the engine, was too powerful at times and not so much at others, and this would cause this knocking that tended to be very loud and damaging to the engine. And so what they did is they started to look at different formulas for what they could do to combat this, and they came up with what was called lead tetraethyl, also confusingly known as tetraethyl lead as well. This was just a lead-based additive that could be added to gasoline, and it did indeed stop engine knock. But it did another thing, and that is that all of the exhaust from these cars that used this gasoline spewed an incredible amount of lead into the atmosphere. Lead is a neurotoxin, and if you get too much of it in you, it can be fatal. It can have all kinds of lasting damaging effects on your nervous system. And it was found by another man who was doing research that the amount of lead in the atmosphere did a hockey stick curve right about the time that this was introduced. And it took a long time, up until the 1970s, before this was removed from from production. Even China finally got into the act and removed it from their production in 2001. But not without the fact that this is now in the blood of many of us that are alive today. We would have been a lot better off without it. And the other thing that he did is he invented CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were, his aim was to replace refrigerants, the chemicals that were used in refrigerators, with something that was less toxic and less volatile. And that's what CFCs were. They were that, but they were also very damaging to the ozone. And this was not something that they knew at the time, but again, here was this colossal failure happening because there was very little feedback. In order to combat this, now, think about this. Thomas Midgley had a patent on lead tetraethyl. There were other options for solving this problem, but because they had the patent and GM also jointly owned it, they were kind of biased to take that as a solution, and they tried to show that it was not harmful at all. But even in the process, they weren't able to do so. That it still ended up showing that when the EPA stepped in, they had to take this out. So you look at all these examples of these epic failures that occurred, and there's some commonalities that some of them shared, some of them don't, but I want to point out a couple of them. The first one is that the failing to learn from the past. Now, this happens. There's a colossal epic failure that echoes something that happened in the past. You saw it with the Maginot Line and the Great Wall of China. They failed to learn from that past. This is not something that's going to work. You think if you'd paid attention to that, you would have been able to figure it out. But that's a really saving grace of failure. And when that's applied, that's kind of like the really obvious things. The others, though, like for example, obsessively narrow focus. Okay, both in the case that where you've got New Coke and Crystal Pepsi, with the sip test, again, that narrow focus didn't show the bigger picture. And this is an important aspect of survivorship bias, which I'm going to go over with in a minute. And that if you don't see the bigger picture and you focus too much on one thing, this can lead to failure that does you no good. Another is stopping at success. A lot of companies and organizations, individuals will get to a point where they kind of feel like, hey, we've made it, as this success is some sort of destination. And really, the recipe there has to be a sustainability of success, which means that you have to constantly, kind of recheck and re-examine whether or not what you're doing really is successful and if it's sustainable. If MySpace had done that, they might have seen the opportunity to continue to compete. Or if the Titanic and the Hindenburg travel lines had looked at their fleets and said, how can we improve the safety of these things so that we can continue to be a dominant force in this industry? That might have saved them. And if you look at something like non-incremental and without feedback, this fits into a lot of areas. A lot of times, if something is built out, here again, if we go back to like the example of the Newton, this device, this PDA that was being built out, the testing was all done internally, so it wasn't a big flop until they released it to the public. So they weren't getting a lot of feedback to see, like, was this really going to work? Was this going to be a viable product? And, when I mentioned about the unit testing and things like that, if there's not a feedback mechanism, that problems that are going to occur, failure points, like what happened with Deepwater Horizon or the Exxon Valdez, these won't come to light. And so, without that mechanism in place, failure ends up being both set up to be catastrophic and ultimately often inevitable. And then finally is the failing to act. In the case of where things were happening with the poisoning of the lead poisoning going into the air, the destruction of the ozone by the CFCs, being able to recognize that and do something about it rather than to kind of go, oh, it was a failure, let's sweep it under the rug, let's not talk about it. Failure is not something that we're comfortable discussing, and so that can lead to this failing to act. And so that's at the opposite side and kind of like the other side of the coin to the failing to learn from the past. So with all that in mind, I want to talk about something that all of these points fit into what is called survivorship bias. And really what this is, I'm going to tell a story that illustrates the concept of survivorship bias to start with, and then I'm going to go in and show you some examples of where this kind of like infiltrates our everyday lives and why it's important to recognize. So back in the early 40s, a man named Abraham Wald joined a group that was set up by the Department of Defense. They were called the Panel of Applied Mathematics. And basically, they were meat-based mainframes. There were no computers back then to do big computational analysis, so they really had to rely on people to solve the problems of modern warfare during World War II. And there was a whole host of problems that they were tasked with. And in this particular example that I want to talk about, this was presented to Abraham Wald. And the military said, hey, look, we've got this situation where we're sending these bombers into enemy territory, and they're basically being shot down about half the time. So that means that every bombing run, any man that was going to go on one of these had about a 50% chance of surviving it. And they knew that in order to win the war, they needed to be more effective at being able to survive these runs. And so they had them come out and look at all of the bombers that had come in from these runs so that they could kind of see what was going on. They wanted to armor up the planes, make them stronger and better, and he wanted them to help them figure out how best to do that. They couldn't just put armor across the whole thing because you can't make a tank fly. So they had to pick and choose where they were going to go. So what they did is they saw that over and over again, the bullet holes tended to accumulate along the wings, around the tail gunner, and down the center of the body. So the wings, the body, the tail gunner, right? Now, considering this information, where would you put the extra armor? Well, naturally, the commanders wanted to put it where they saw all the holes because they thought, okay, we could protect all that stuff there. And to his credit, Wald was able to see instantly that the holes were not. Sorry, that the holes were not where the planes were the weakest, but that's where they could take the most damage, and then still make it back. So why is that important? Well, what that shows is that the commanders were not paying attention to the things that mattered the most, which was the planes that weren't there, the non-survivors. So you see, survivorship bias is our tendency to focus on survivors while ignoring whatever you would call non-survivors. So this could be focusing on the living versus the dead, focusing on winners versus losers, and focusing on success instead of failures. So where does this come into play? Let's see here. So the misconception is that you should focus on the successful if you want to be successful, right? The truth is that when failure becomes invisible, the difference between failure and success may also become invisible. And what does that mean? Okay, so survivorship bias, it flash freezes our brain into a state of ignorance and for which you believe success is more common than it truly is, and therefore you leap to the conclusion that it must be also easier to obtain. So you develop a completely inaccurate assessment of reality, and thanks to the prejudice that grants to the tiny number of survivors the privilege of representing a much larger group in which they originally belonged to. And so not only do you fail to recognize that there's information that you're missing, you fail to recognize that there's any information to be had there at all. This is pretty important because it plays an important role into a lot of factors that we run into every day. For example, job satisfaction surveys. Job satisfaction surveys are handed out in companies all over the country, all over the world, and they're given to employees of the company. And they're meant to measure job satisfaction, arguably, I guess. But since they're only given to the people that actually work at the company and not people that have left because they were dissatisfied for some reason, they can't measure the one thing that they were designed to measure. And so if people, the leaders of these companies don't recognize that there is that bias there, then everything just seems rosy, like, hey, everything's going great. And then that's a largely inaccurate picture. The Volkswagen Beetle is a good example of where survivorship bias shows up. So a lot of people like to believe that, craftsmanship back in the day was a lot better, and that they don't make them like they used to. You buy a new car and you have to replace the tires, or you're replacing this, and this breaks, and there goes a Volkswagen Beetle that looks like it just ran off the assembly line yesterday. They don't really make them like they used to. Well, really what's happening here is that there's no evidence for you to see all the crappy cars that were made for years and years that are rusting away in junkyards somewhere. All you see are the ones that were produced in such massive quantities that they're still sticking around nowadays, and so it makes it seem like they're of a better quality and a higher craftsmanship. And while that may be the case in some small amount, that's not representative of the larger group. This also shows up in things like, if you go back and you think about a period of time, like the 1920s or the Baroque period, and you think, oh gosh, boy, this amazing art and music that was made back then, it's not like that nowadays. In today's pop culture, there's so much crap and there's very few masterpieces. Well, is that because they were so much better at creating art back in the day, or is it, does it have to do with the fact that we actually pay attention just to the stuff that was good, and everything that was bad from back in those periods is largely forgotten, and so it fairly kind of refocuses us to bias and think of the days gone by as being so much better than they actually were. And so those are some examples where that sort of like happens organically. Here's an example of where survivorship bias can be exploited. The mentalist Darren Brown went on television and he told his viewing audience that he could flip a coin 10 times in a row and get it to turn up heads. And then he went on to flip a coin into a bowl with the camera on him the whole time, and he flipped it 10 times into the bowl, landed heads every single time, just as he predicted. And so how did he do that? Well, see, what he did is he filmed himself flipping the coin into the bowl for about 9 hours till he got the result that he wanted. And then he edited out all the failures where he didn't, and just presented the one success. Amazing, right? So again, we focus on the success. We don't focus on the things that we don't see. And this all brings me to the science of luck. And in order to talk about the science of luck, I want to be able to say that there's not, luck is not some magical thing, okay? They're seeing nowadays that luck actually has much more to do with how people interact with chance. So we may be very bad, and it might be even impossible to predict randomness and chaos that exist in everyday reality. But what we can measure, to a certain degree, is what happens when people with different attitudes and different tactics interact with chance. There was a man named Richard Wiseman that conducted a study where he put out into newspaper ads that got 400 people of all different professions to answer and be part of a study over 10 years. And he picked them to, do you think of yourself as being very lucky or very unlucky? And have them in these two groups. And then he had them keep diaries and do all these other things to measure kind of like their experience throughout life. And so one of the experiments he did is he had these groups of people come in and gave them a very easy task, which is to open a newspaper and count the number of photographs in the newspaper. And what he found was that the people that considered themselves to be very unlucky took on average about 2 minutes to be able to complete the task. And the people that considered themselves very lucky took on average a few seconds. And what he had done, on the second page of the newspaper, he had printed in large block text, "Stop reading now. There are 43 photos in this newspaper." And a little bit further in, he had another block of text that says, "Stop reading this and take it back to the instructor. You've just won $250. And the people that rated themselves very unlucky almost never saw these. So he started to postulate and to look at this as saying, okay, what's happening is that people that consider themselves very unlucky, they like things to be very controlled. They don't like to take chances. They don't like to expose themselves to risk. And so they follow along kind of a very narrow path, whereas people that consider themselves lucky, they try different things. They do stuff, they don't leave and go the same way they came, and they just expose themselves to more risk. And as a result of that, they fail more often, but they also shrug off that failure and try something new. Sometimes it works out. So that's all to say that to me that demonstrates that what happens is that when you apply the science of luck, you see that failure actually has a very positive thing when it's done in a controlled way. When you understand, how to mitigate sort of the epic failure piece of it, and as well as to garner some of the good things that failure gives you, which is the ability to learn. So now I want to talk about some points of when failure led to success. Now, I could talk for hours, days on examples. I had to really limit down the examples that I had here. There were many, and so I'm just going to give you a couple. Yeah. So we've got, let's see, bubble wrap, right? Bubble wrap, you may find interesting to know, was actually not invented as a packing material. Bubble wrap was invented by a couple of guys that were trying to create textured wallpaper. And so they put together this product, and they went out and tried to market it, and unsurprisingly, nobody really liked it, and it didn't work. So they were undeterred, and they went back, and they said, you know what, we got a different application for it. It's going to be greenhouse insulation. And again, that just didn't take off. And it took a marketer who was working for a company that was funding them to see that the potential for this. IBM was releasing their 1401 long word computer, and he was able to demonstrate to IBM in a presentation the merits of bubble wrap as a packing material. IBM said that's great. They liked it. They started to ship, and they ordered this. Nowadays, the company that makes the product, that original company, grosses over $4 billion a year. Safety glass. Safety glass was the result of a man, a French chemist who was working in his lab, and he accidentally knocked over a flask that he had sitting on one of his counters, and it broke, but it maintained its shape. And curious, he went over and examined it and saw that there was a resin that had dried in there, a clear plastic resin. And he recognized the potential of this. Up until this point, automobiles that had glass windshields that were not safety glass, when they broke, they tended to shatter into sharp pieces of glass that were very dangerous and often fatal to the passengers in the car. And realized that with this application, he would be able to make that entire situation much more safe for the driver. Also, its applications used in bulletproof glass and other things. There are many applications there. But again, this was not something he set out to try to do. It was kind of more of a lucky happenstance. Play-Doh was originally created as a wallpaper cleaner. It was white. It had detergent in it. And it was created because back in the day, wallpaper was paper, and you couldn't wash it with a cloth or anything wet because that would ruin it. So the properties of the compound that they made Play-Doh from worked well. This was because back then most houses were heated with coal, and this created a thin layer of soot over everything, and so it was hard to clean. But with the advent of after World War II, heating went from coal to oil and natural gas, and so that problem started to go away, and then vinyl wallpaper came out, in which you could then wipe with a cloth, and you didn't need this anymore. And so the company was basically faced with this is their main product, and they were going to basically go under. They were going to fail. But there was a school teacher who saw the potential application of making Christmas ornaments out of this. So they removed the detergent, added some coloring, and they came up with Play-Doh, which they took into the schools, and it was wildly popular. They reformulated it, and they were able to create one of the most ubiquitous and recognized toys these days. Super glue was actually, it was discovered by accident twice. The inventor was originally trying to make clear plastic sights for guns for Allied troops in World War II, and accidentally created this incredibly effective bonding agent, which he then, for whatever reason, didn't see any application for and put on the shelf. And several years later, he was working for Eastman Kodak and collaborating with another colleague, and they were doing some other things, and he brought that back down and then actually saw the application for it and took it to management, and they put it on the market. Originally, it was called Eastman number 910, but they got a more snappier name and named it Super Glue. And that's obviously been wildly successful as well. And then finally, probably one of the more famous ones is Post-it notes. There was a man that was hired out of college to come work for the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, which was later named 3M, and he was trying to develop a super strong adhesive for application in aeronautics, and what he ended up doing was creating a very weak adhesive. And then through happy luck, had some stuck onto a piece of paper, and it ended up being something that they started using in the lab to take notes on. And then eventually a marketer saw it and said, hey, what if we actually sold this externally? Interestingly, there's another piece here where, again, kind of narrow focus. They took this and said, hey, let's put it in these stores and see how well it does. And so they kind of produced these press and peel notes, they called. They're not very successful. People didn't buy them at all. But undeterred, and to their credit, the original marketer guy went back and he took these and actually gave them to a number of offices in Boise, Idaho. And that was the key, because then once it was in people's hands, they were able to use it and see that, oh, this is really great. And from there, it became the wildly successful product that we know it to be today. So finally, as I've gone through all of these, I hope that shows, as you can see, the contrast of epic failure versus the application of failure to achieve success by understanding its components, what goes into it, and understanding that, survivorship bias plays a big role in this, and that without an understanding of that, you're not going to understand how to effectively use failure to your advantage. And to take that to one step further, I want to talk about one other big obstacle that comes into play. And that's blame and shame. Failure gets, I think, a really bad rap. I think, we're all really afraid to fail because we kind of look at it as being, you're sort of marked. There's a lot of, negative feeling around it that you should never fail, and that, you should only fail as much until you succeed, and then once you've succeeded, you should never fail again. And I think that's a real, it's a real shame that that's the way it is. And I think that blame and shame play a big component of that. But I also want to kind of put out there that I think blame and shame are both very terrible things that if we recognize them for what they are, I think it would behoove us all to just try to stop and not practice at all, because ultimately it's a corrosive and unhealthy way of going about things. And that if we can have empathy for those that we work with and to use failure and to accept acceptable risks so that we can try things out and fail on purpose, fail fast instead of fail last, I think that would really help. So I'm going to let Dr. Brene Brown talk about this.
How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I'm a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of that story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the na thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
So what I like about Brené's approach and her ideas and philosophy on these things is that she really shows that it's much more constructive for us to be open to accepting failure, especially when it comes as part of a plan, that we're going to execute. That we're not going to like try to pretend that things aren't going to go wrong, because inevitably things do. And as long as we have some kind of a framework in which we're working, there's still quite a bit of opportunity for us to take failure and get something out of it. So, Luttrell's great quote. If you embrace failure because you recognize that it's not going to go away, it's not something that you can just sort of mitigate out of existence. It's a fact of life. Almost no success that's ever occurred of any note took place without some failure coming before it. And ultimately, a lot of the real good success that's happened in the world is a result of the application of what failure teaches. So if you can learn to embrace it, and you can learn to be accepting of those that you work with and that you spend time with and you interact with, to say that, hey, how can we use this, and not use it as a thing that a way of CYA or a way of passing the buck. I think that we could be much more effective at getting more out of it. So that just means that we need to learn how to take appropriate risks. This is why things like Agile as a methodology for really doing any kind of work, not just software development, but as a way of getting that constant feedback. A way of being able to say, let's have a retrospective and talk about what worked and what didn't. What should we continue to do? What should we stop doing? And what have we not considered yet that maybe we should consider? Having that space and that mentality amongst an entire team is just going to ultimately lead to better results and outcomes. So, but you got to be willing to understand that failure is okay as long as it's appropriate, and we can shrug it off, learn from it, and use it to our advantage. And that means that you have to act. So when failure occurs, what you really need to avoid is to forget about it, to try to cover it up. If it's part of a cycle of shame for you, then you're not going to want to learn from that. You're not going to want to take that and act on it. But if you're decisive, if you see, okay, that didn't work, now I know not what to do. Or I see that it gave me this other idea that I hadn't even considered before. I mean, that's the seed of innovation. And that only happens if you actually take the time to act instead of, going into brain dead mode and trying to hide away from the shameful feelings that may come from something like that. And then finally is to just really embed the learning. If you recognize the value that failure brings, especially when it comes to a controlled situation, I think that it allows you to see that there's so much there to learn. I'd wager that if you think about it, if you set out to do something and you achieve your goal without any mistakes whatsoever, what have you really learned? I mean, you did what you thought you were going to do, so there's no new information there. On the other hand, if you set out to do something and you trip and fall along the way and you learn a few things and you find a better way than you even thought in the first place, that's the seed of learning. So again, applying this throughout your life, I think, will just allow you to be more patient with yourself and with others and to get much more out of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, whether that's writing software, doing design, developing plans for your business, interacting with your family, growing as a human being. So parting thoughts. Failure is inevitable, so take advantage of it. You're not going to ever go through life without failing at something. But if you're prepared to, then you can handle it much better. Being able to roll with the punches, that's just so important. Be cognizant of this phenomenon called survivorship bias. You should always be asking yourself, what am I not seeing? What is not part of this picture? Am I focusing too much on one aspect, that narrow focus that ignores the bigger picture? Always take the time to ask yourself and to, even when you feel very confident, zoom out and say, am I seeing everything? Am I seeing the bigger picture? If you could do that, then I'd wager you'll have a much better chance at succeeding. Just don't do this. Blaming and shaming are they're just detrimental to morale, to a team. That may be obvious to some of you. Maybe to some of you, you're like, boy, I kind of recognize that actually happens maybe at my workplace or in my professional life in places. Find ways that you can mitigate that by practicing vulnerability and empathy with those around you. And I think that'll help diffuse what damage, blame, and shame can bring. And then finally, just, fail better. You may be making mistakes today, in your work or in your life that really are, built up around the fact that you're really trying to avoid them from happening. But find ways in which you can accept failure, that it's an acceptable risk. It's something that we can try because they're small enough, they're incremental enough. They're part of a sprint rather than, a 3-month project with a big reveal at the end. But, no matter what you're doing, if you're doing that, the biggest thing about failing better is just learning how to learn from your failure. So, that I take any questions or comments, heckling? Yes?
Mike, I have a question for you out of curiosity. Did you happen to have some sort of epic failure that inspired you to do this?
Many of them, yes. It's a good question. I'd say that we probably all have, examples of things that have happened to us in our lives where, you could see maybe it was hard or it was rough, but maybe we try to forget, rather than to learn. I actually, if I were to say a specific example, there were just some big major projects that I worked on at one of my former companies where, it was sort of status quo. We don't talk about the fact that this is inevitably going wrong. Has anybody ever been on a coding death march? Oh, wow, look at that. A few of us, huh? So where does that end up, right? So that's a perfect example where, you're kind of like, we have to go here no matter what, and even though we see that this is just not working, because we're failing to act, that's where that comes into play. So that happened to me, and that was part of the inspiration, so, yeah.
Tips on changing your culture if it is in a situation where they're not willing to do that?
Well, I mentioned Agile, and I think that's an important piece because, to be honest, if you're not practicing something like that, look, I work in an organization, we're a software company, but I work in the marketing department, okay? And I went to my boss and I said, look, I know that what we've been doing is we have these silos and everything goes through a ticketing system. It's very waterfall, but there's also a lot of, issues with, people saying, well, I didn't get this because he didn't get that to me in time, and a lot of blaming and shaming going on. And so I started to educate them on using Agile as a way of doing this. And a couple weeks ago, I was able to get a whole class of people to go through a boot camp for Agile. And that included our VP of marketing, who had never heard of the concept before. And after coming out of it, he was convinced. He's like, this is the best thing that we've ever looked at doing, and he has vowed to have everybody in the department go through that training so that we can all start practicing it. So that's a good example. But I mean, I think you need to set the example yourself as well as to look for areas like that where you can maybe introduce some change.
Can I follow up on your comment? Our group does 3-week sprints in development.
3-week sprints?
Which means product development has to give us work in 3-week sprints, right? Because we can't do sprints unless they're giving us things to do every 3 weeks. Which means marketing is getting new functionality every 3 weeks. And it's causing them problems because they're not used to having the system always changing.
Yeah.
Which is with Waterfall, they get new things every 6 months. They're getting something new every 3 weeks.
Okay. So is that a comment, or you have a question?
It's a good thing because it's a problem they're having. It's like, how are we supposed to promote the product because you keep making it better every 3 weeks? Is this would you rather not us tell you? Maybe every 6 months we tell you what we did instead of letting you know ahead of time?
Well, it sounds to me like they, and this question is around how do we involve, like maybe the marketing department that's seeing the product of our labor in understanding that this changing thing is coming forth. Something there that kind of sticks out to me is aren't they maybe the product owner in some ways? And where are they in the sprint planning? Are they being involved in any of the daily stand-ups that go into the work that's coming out? Maybe there's ways there that you can get better.
The company is more Waterfall, and they acquired us.
Okay.
So they ended up acquiring an Agile team that's producing
Yeah, well, I feel for you. Yeah, and to be honest, sometimes it just takes time. So you just have to kind of, in that situation, I'd say just try to persevere. Try to, I've done a different talk on agile is not a 4-letter word, where, kind of selling it to the execs about, the ROI on agile, the philosophy behind it. I found that when people are in the right mindset, if you present it in the right way, they'll see the value and you can start to have that change, like I have recently.
Well, they weren't complaining.
Oh,
They weren't complaining. It was more of they had to adjust.
okay, they had to adjust. Well, good. Yes, back in the back? Oh, sorry, are you just stretching? Anybody else? I thought I saw something over here. Maybe I answered the question. Yes?
Well, one thing I was going to say is that something I've encountered is also being, sometimes if you accept that you can fail as a good thing, then you're also okay with being wrong about stuff. Because I had a customer where he always had like really technical ideas that didn't really work with the architecture we had, and he always dug his heels in because everyone else just said, no, you're wrong. But then I started saying, okay, well, this is the reason why I'm confused as to why this would not work. Help me understand where I'm wrong. And then when I did that, then he would start explaining and go, oh, wait, no, I'm wrong about this part right here. But then I would go, oh, but you're right about this part right here. So once you actually allow for failure, you're able to create a more collaborative environment, because also you get rid of the blame game and everything like that, and you start working collaboratively towards a future of success, not trying to basically make sure that everyone knows that I'm the most right person in the room. So I think it's a very useful thing to remember that personally.
That's great. That's a great example. And if just to touch on that a little bit, I talked about survivorship bias a lot in this talk, but there's a lot of these kinds of cognitive biases that exist that if we become aware of them, like the one that you just pointed out, where if you kind of like take your own viewpoint and you look at it as sort of, I want to prove to you, versus kind of saying, well, I'm going to let you prove to me, based on like opening up and saying it's okay for me to be wrong. That's a great example of where having empathy and openness, around the idea that failure is not a bad thing, but it's part, a lot of times it's part of the progress. That's great. I'm glad to hear that you're able to do that.
With software and source control, it seems like it's incredibly easy to actually pinpoint who made a mistake. You can blame someone's check-in for breaking something.
Mm-hmm.
And so, since the tools are so readily available to actually blame, how do you avoid that kind of culture where, oh, something's wrong, let me go see exactly what's broken?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that, it's even called a blame, right? Well, I think that maybe we want to separate the verbiage or the way that that setup is. Okay, we can call it a blame, but it's the way that we treat it, because we've all been there. Whether you write Lua or C# or JavaScript, or you write the written word and you make a typo. Everybody makes mistakes. And I think that's okay. And it's the kind of thing that, as long as you're open and accepting about it, that's why we do code reviews, because that way you can actually learn. And it's not just about trying to find errors or pointing out where you made an architectural faux pas or you violated some design pattern, but it's about like knowledge sharing. Like sometimes that's the only way that, it's easy to learn for certain people. And in other cases, it's, a great way for you to see a novel concept or a novel approach to a problem. Because if you're focused, in a certain way of thinking as a developer, for example, you may be often going down the same road until you're able to open up and see other examples. And if you're doing that, where you can see a blame and you can see the whole, the code base is through a review, that could be an opportunity. But that really does have to start with, having the philosophy that, this is how we do it. We don't, and holding people accountable. I'll be accountable for my own code. If I make a mistake, I'll say, hey, I made this mistake, but I'm not going to also use that as a way to kind of wallow in shame and self-pity on something. These are great questions. Anything else? Any other comments, questions? I'm going to check my Twitter feed over here real quick. So I could find the winner. Okay, let's see here. Is Brian Forsyth here? Brian? No? Did he leave early? Okay. Must be present to win. Okay. How about Karen B? Is Karen B here? All right. Here we go. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your time here at Star Trek.